I'm going to present Obama's presidency and his struggles in terms of this theory of, and it's just a theory, it's a working hypothesis, of cultural complexes. It's kind of how I understand the difficulties that he has, the forces that he's struggling with, and the tremendous opportunities that he's at times been able to realize. But it all springs from this theory of the cultural complex. And the theory says that cultural complexes are every bit as real, every bit as formative, every bit as ubiquitous, and every bit as powerful in their emotional and behavioral impact on individuals and groups as are personal complexes. So it's a whole separate realm of complexes that exist both in the psyche of the individual, but also in the psyche of the collective. Or you could say that in the psyche of the individual, there is a stream of the collective psyche, and that stream of the collective psyche is made up of cultural complexes. So each one of us has our personal complexes, but we also have our cultural complexes, and in the social order itself, cultural complexes are playing themselves out every day. And once you start to think in terms of this theory, you can look at a newspaper and you can just write down which cultural complexes are parading across the newspaper on any particular day. But this was a time of enormous cultural upheaval. And in some ways, if we're going to talk about Obama and symbolic process and leadership, if you go back to the 60s, the origins of a lot of what we're talking about, certainly you can go as far back as Bernard did this morning to the Egyptians, but I'm not going to start with the Egyptians. I'm going to start with 1967. And in 1967, we had the Vietnam War, we had race riots in New Haven and other parts of the country. I happen to be in New Haven. And the country was in tatters. It really was coming apart. And so there was no image of wholeness that was a prevalent symbolic image of culture at that time. I think Rauschenberg got it as well as anybody did in this image, because you've got the man on the moon, and you've got Vietnam War, and you've got Janis Joplin singing her heart out, and you've got riots on the streets in wherever, all over the country, where there's a black man lying dead, and you've got Martin Luther King shot and John F. Kennedy shot. So that it was a time in which our culture was coming apart at the seams on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was like a hole got blown in the ego of the collective psyche of America as it had been constituted up until that time. And all sorts of energies started to break through, which in a way were the inheritors of things that broke through the collective persona of the mid to late 60s in an absolutely revolutionary way. And many of the things we think about and study today, and even the fascination and intoxication with Obama, mirrored sort of the epic of the Kennedys and of Martin Luther King, and the issues in some ways remain the same. We have a war that was unpopular, and we have a president-elect who was Catholic, which at that time had never happened before. You had race riots between blacks and whites, so you had war, you had race, you had a president coming out of a part of the population that had never been represented before in the White House. It was an incredibly stimulating time, and the purpose of all this is to begin to demonstrate the idea that there's such a thing as the collective psyche. Now, you may all take that for granted. I mean, that may just be something that you think we all know about and has always been there, but actually, if you talk to people about the collective psyche, a lot of people go dumb when you say something like that. They really don't know what you're talking about. You're talking about a very subtle thread of psychic life and psychic energy that flows through large groups of people, often imperceptible in the same way that soul can be imperceptible, but moves people very, very deeply. And it's hard to, if you're a sociologist, you can say this group of people votes this way and this group of people votes that way, but to talk about the collective psyche is a much more elusive phenomena, and I think the way one tunes into it is through art. I think our artists and our poets are the ones who put us in tune with that level of psychic reality, and that's why I chose the Rauschenberg image, because collective psyche is at the heart of what I think he's evoking in this very powerful image. Let me give you the characteristics of a cultural complex. Complexes express themselves in powerful moods and repetitive behaviors. They are highly charged emotional. A highly charged emotional or affective reactivity is their calling card. You know when you've stepped on a complex, personal or cultural, when somebody gets really upset with you. And I have never given a talk on cultural complexes without triggering one in somebody. They're actually very difficult to talk about because they're so powerful and they're so reactive in their emotionality. They resist our most heroic efforts at consciousness, and they remain for the most part unconscious. They accumulate experiences that validate their point of view and create a storehouse of self-affirming ancestral memories. That's a really important part, because if you start to track a complex like racism in the United States, you realize that it's got memory upon memory upon memory. And it just builds like a snowball. And if you touch the complex, you're not just getting an individual's reaction, you're getting an individual's family's reaction and their ancestors' reaction, and it's all coming up at you in some very powerful emotional outburst or wave that sort of wipes both of you out in terms of human beings able to relate to one another. Personal and cultural complexes function in an involuntary, autonomous fashion and tend to affirm a simplistic point of view that replaces more everyday ambiguity and uncertainty with fixed, often self-righteous attitudes to the world. If you touch a complex in an Israeli or in a Palestinian, and it's got this virulent history of antagonism and conflict, or a black and a white person in this country, or any number of groups that we can think of, not only do you get the wave of affect and ancestral memory, but you also get very fixed, righteous opinions, which are inflexible and unmovable, and there's no point in continuing the discussion until it kind of settles down. Finally, in this characteristics of cultural complexes, the argument runs, or the theory runs, they have archetypal cores. That is, they express typically human attitudes and are rooted in primordial ideas about what is meaningful, making them very hard to resist, reflect upon, and discriminate.
There's two questions I'd like to present, comments really. First one's from India, second one's from France. Kind of gives you a nice sense of our world relatedness. This is from Lena. She's in Bangalore, India. Hi, this is Lena from Bangalore. Thank you, Asheville, for a very interesting seminar. It's past midnight here, and I'm going to try and listen to Tom's talk in a while. So God bless her for going past midnight and listening to the talk, but she's hopefully hanging in there. I was very interested in what Bernard had to say about the apocalyptic effect that seems to be gripping the world. While that seems to be so, I have seen, like most people in this region, the most terrible grief and sadness that cyclones, drought, tsunamis, and floods wreak on the poorest of the poor who live on the riverbanks near the seashore. These are folks who depend on the waters for their livelihood, in the land which suffers from the lack of irrigation and severely hot summers. When they are evacuated from the riverbanks, for instance, they move, as it were, to higher ground, literally. And when the waters subside, leaving its trail of such utter sadness, these people continue to live by the river, for it is their livelihood in more than the material sense. Their histories are tied up in it. Their myths and legends and stories are connected to it, as is the land. And so they live there and return. So yes, as the film and other Hollywood movies reflect the apocalyptic effect, there is, it seems, the reinforcing of the human spirit as well, as the psyche reaffirms the symbol-making function in the lives of these simple folks. Thanks again for a very interesting seminar. Warmly, Lena. The riverbed, yet again a powerful image of that riverbed. Any comment on that? That's really just a thought, but any comment before I move on?
It's really nice that somebody in India is awake at midnight and sharing with us. It's kind of amazing to me, and it means that we sort of share a global riverbed at this point.